dramatic raid of the Hells Angels clubhouse in Providence.
It's a story you first saw as breaking last night at 5. Tonight we're learning why state police swarmed the Messer Street building.
The local police won't step in, not because they're lazy, but because they're outnumbered and outgunned. In small California towns like Barstow and Fontana, this nightmare became reality. By the late 1960s, these desert communities were no longer just highway rest stops. They had transformed into strongholds for one of the most feared outlaw motorcycle clubs in the world, the Hells Angels. Entire neighborhoods fell silent when the sound of roaring engines echoed through the streets. Even seasoned cops admitted they couldn't keep up. The club commanded more eyes, more weapons, and more control than anyone had anticipated. A motorcycle club that started as weekend riders had evolved into something far more sinister. They weren't just passing through anymore, they were staying, and they were taking control. The birth of an empire. Fontana, California, 1948. The Second World War had just ended, leaving thousands of veterans searching for purpose, adrenaline, and brotherhood. In the sun-baked streets of this working-class town, a small group of these men found all three on motorcycles. What began as a local riding group quickly mutated into something darker. The Hells Angels Motorcycle Club wasn't just about bikes anymore. It was about loyalty, territory, and fear. Fontana, nestled in San Bernardino County, provided the perfect breeding ground. Away from city pressures, surrounded by open roads and sparse law enforcement, the club began to thrive. As the years crawled by, chapters started sprouting across California like a disease. San Bernardino, Oakland, Bakersfield, each one more organized, more aggressive, and more dangerous than the last. By the 1960s, they had strategically pushed into the Central Valley and the Inland Empire. These weren't random locations, they were calculated moves. Quiet highways, understaffed police departments, and vast stretches of land made it easy for the Hells Angels to grow without resistance. What had started as a brotherhood was transforming into a full-blown criminal organization. People noticed, police noticed, but stopping them? That was another story entirely. Planting their flag, the Hells Angels never forgot their roots. Fontana remained their spiritual home, but nearby towns like Barstow soon felt the weight of their presence pressing down like a storm cloud. Fontana wasn't just their birthplace, it was their strategic command center. The town offered easy access to vital highways like I-10 and I-15, which became arteries for movement, smuggling, and territorial expansion. Law enforcement found themselves dealing with club members repeatedly, but these weren't random encounters. Every interaction was calculated, every move deliberate. In 1967, just west of Barstow and Alta Loma, authorities uncovered something that chilled them to the bone. A property known as the Gray Ranch had been operating as a Hells Angels fortress. When officers raided the compound, they arrested 13 members and discovered a scene that defied belief. Drugs, firearms, and women and children living in makeshift quarters. This wasn't just a hangout, it was a command center. But what terrified law enforcement most wasn't the weapons cache or the drug stash. It was how deeply rooted the club had become in the community. Neighbors knew exactly who they were, and most were too frightened to speak. The Angels didn't need to storm city halls or run for office. Their influence spread through fear, reputation, and the simple fact that challenging them meant risking everything. In isolated towns like Barstow, quiet, underfunded, and forgotten, local police departments lacked the manpower to mount any serious resistance. A single clubhouse could house a dozen men who followed their own twisted code of law. On the highways, they moved in packs, their presence impossible to ignore. They wanted people to see them. They wanted people to know who controlled these streets. The Bass Lake invasions. By the early 1960s, controlling territory wasn't enough. The Hells Angels wanted to make statements, loud, unmistakable declarations of their power. Bass Lake became their chosen stage for these demonstrations. Bass Lake is a serene mountain resort town, nestled in Madera County, California. Surrounded by towering forests and peaceful family cabins, it seemed like the last place on earth you'd expect to see outlaw bikers. But starting in 1963, the Hells Angels made it one of their regular gathering spots, and their arrival transformed paradise into a war zone. Memorial Day weekend, and later the 4th of July became dates circled in red on every local calendar. The club would descend upon the quiet lakeside community. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of bikers, flooding the streets with the thunder of engines and the stench of exhaust. What began as a gathering quickly escalated into something far more sinister. Locals and business owners watched in horror as their peaceful town was consumed overnight. Streets became rivers of roaring motorcycles. Bars were overwhelmed and often destroyed. Law enforcement, already stretched impossibly thin, had to call in reinforcements from neighboring counties. But this wasn't just noise pollution. Fights erupted without warning. Public drinking became rampant, and intimidation transformed from threat to routine. In 1965, after years of escalating tension, the local sheriff's department decided they'd had enough. They erected roadblocks to keep the bikers out, pushed for legal injunctions, and rallied public support. But the Hells Angels pushed back with devastating force. That year, the standoffs with law enforcement were so intense they attracted national media attention. Reporters from Life, Newsweek, and the Saturday Evening Post descended upon the scene to cover what looked like a small-town civil war. The image of a family-friendly lake town being held hostage by a biker club sent shockwaves through California and beyond. The Silent Conquest. What happened in Bass Lake was loud, visible, and temporary. But in places like Fontana and Barstow, the takeover followed a different, more insidious pattern. Slower, quieter, but infinitely more dangerous and permanent. In these communities, law enforcement didn't just get overwhelmed during special events. They were being systematically outmaneuvered year-round, losing ground in a war they barely realized they were fighting. The clearest evidence of this emerged in the late 1960s, when investigators began discovering how deeply the Hells Angels had embedded themselves into the fabric of entire communities. The 1967 Gray Ranch raid in Alta Loma, just outside Fontana, revealed the scope of this infiltration. Police had expected to find a few illegal weapons and maybe some stolen motorcycles. Instead, they uncovered a fully operational base of criminal activity. Massive drug stockpiles, stolen goods, weapons arsenals, and entire families living on-site in a twisted commune. This wasn't a hideout or a temporary camp. It was a functioning outpost of an outlaw empire. The people living in surrounding neighborhoods had learned to maintain absolute silence. Complaints to police were virtually non-existent, not because everything was peaceful, but because everyone understood the consequences of speaking out. The club's reputation for swift and brutal retaliation preceded them everywhere they went. In towns like Barstow, the problem transcended simple intimidation. These were small police departments working with shoestring budgets and skeleton crews. Meanwhile, the Hells Angels had evolved into a tightly disciplined organization, with members ready to mobilize at a moment's notice if one of their own faced any threat. They operated sophisticated clubhouses, ran legitimate businesses as fronts, and cultivated relationships, sometimes with people in surprisingly influential positions. Over time, it became nearly impossible for police to gather evidence without someone tipping off the club. The Angels had built their own intelligence network, complete with informants and early warning systems that often functioned better than official law enforcement channels. By the early 1970s, the club wasn't just making appearances, they had established permanent settlements. They controlled houses, owned businesses, and built clubhouses that functioned as regional headquarters. Residents frequently reported seeing groups of bikers patrolling neighborhoods, acting as if they were the legitimate law enforcement authority. The message was crystal clear. Outsiders weren't welcome, and insiders understood the rules without being told. Police departments attempted to fight back, but resources were pathetically inadequate. Planning a raid on a single property could take weeks of preparation, and during that time, word almost always leaked out through the club's network. Even when federal agencies joined the effort, progress remained frustratingly slow. Surveillance operations were nearly impossible because the Hells Angels maintained their own counter-surveillance systems, tracking who entered their territories, who asked the wrong questions, and who didn't belong. Fear wasn't limited to civilian residents. It infected law enforcement as well. Officers openly admitted that confronting a single member meant risking retaliation from an entire chapter. Some cops avoided solo patrols near known club properties. Others simply left the force altogether, unable to handle the constant tension and implicit threats. In Barstow, this shift became impossible to ignore. As bikers established permanent operations in and around the town, local law enforcement began retreating. It wasn't an official surrender. There were no signed documents or public announcements. But the reality was unmistakable. When residents stopped calling the police and started either handling problems themselves or simply enduring them in silence, the message couldn't have been clearer. The system had collapsed. By the time larger agencies finally intervened, FBI, ATF, and state task forces, the damage was already extensive and deeply rooted. The Hells Angels had spent years methodically building their presence, creating networks, and establishing control. Undoing that level of entrenchment wasn't going to happen overnight, and everyone involved understood that this would be a long, dangerous war when fear turned to violence. For years, the Hells Angels built their empire through intimidation and psychological control, but eventually the simmering tension exploded into open violence, and law enforcement could no longer maintain their policy of cautious avoidance. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, reports of violent crimes involving Hells Angels members began escalating across California. Bar fights turned into attempted murders. Simple assaults became attacks with deadly weapons. Weapons charges multiplied exponentially. What had once existed as whispered rumors and unsubstantiated fears now appeared in official police reports with disturbing frequency. The pattern that emerged wasn't random violence or individual members acting out. This was coordinated criminal activity. The evidence pointed to systematic organized crime operations with clear hierarchies, established territories, and ruthless enforcement mechanisms. In the Central Valley and the Inland Empire, multiple chapters became linked to serious felonies, including extortion rings, large-scale drug trafficking operations, and armed robbery sprees. These weren't isolated incidents carried out by rogue individuals. These were carefully planned operations, executed by people with official ranks, established rules, and guaranteed backup from their brothers. The most dramatic turning point came decades later, in 2024. In Bakersfield, California, law enforcement executed one of the largest operations in recent memory, targeting the entire local chapter of the Hells Angels. The charges read like a catalog of nightmare crimes: kidnapping, robbery, assault with deadly weapons, conspiracy, and numerous other violent felonies. When the Kern County Sheriff's Office, working in partnership with state and federal agencies, executed their coordinated raid, they didn't just arrest a few troublemakers. They systematically dismantled the entire chapter structure, including the president, vice president, and every ranking member. This wasn't just law enforcement making an arrest. It was the complete decapitation of a criminal organization. The operation represented years of painstaking surveillance, dangerous undercover work, and countless hours of wiretapped conversations. Law enforcement had finally assembled the evidence they needed: ironclad proof that the chapter was conducting violent criminal operations across the entire region. Among the items seized during the raids were extensive firearms collections, caches of stolen property, and detailed documents linking the local chapter to larger criminal networks spanning multiple states. The Bakersfield takedown wasn't an isolated victory. Throughout 2024, Hells Angels clubhouses in cities like Stockton and Turlock were raided in coordinated operations. These raids uncovered dozens of illegal weapons, high-capacity magazines designed for warfare, and stolen merchandise worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. In Sacramento, federal authorities conducted massive coordinated sweeps that resulted in multiple arrests and extensive asset seizures. The message from law enforcement was unmistakable. The era of passive tolerance was over. But these victories came at an enormous cost. Undercover agents who had infiltrated various biker clubs, like ATF agent Jay Dobbins in the early 2000s, later revealed just how dangerous their assignments had been. Dobbins, who posed as a member of an outlaw biker club for nearly 2 years, described the constant threat not just of being discovered, but of surviving long enough to complete his mission and extract safely. The violence wasn't theoretical or exaggerated for dramatic effect. It was brutally real and utterly unpredictable. Informants frequently backed out at the last minute, too terrified to follow through. Others simply disappeared entirely, their fates unknown. When raids finally occurred, law enforcement teams had to treat every door as a potential killing zone. The Hells Angels weren't passive targets waiting to be arrested. They maintained armed security, sophisticated lookout systems, and detailed escape plans. Still, as legal pressure mounted and federal indictments accumulated, cracks began appearing in the club's armor. Some members chose cooperation over loyalty. Others fled to different states or even different countries. Several chapters simply shut down operations entirely, not because they wanted to abandon their criminal enterprises, but because continuing meant certain imprisonment or worse. The anatomy of a takeover. When people hear that the Hells Angels took over a town, they often envision scenes from action movies, chaos in the streets, violent confrontations, or dramatic standoffs with police. The reality is far more calculated, methodical, and ultimately more terrifying than any Hollywood fiction. The Hells Angels don't need to storm city halls or intimidate elected officials. Their version of conquest is quieter, more surgical, and devastatingly effective. It begins with careful target selection. They choose towns that are geographically isolated, chronically under-policed, and strategically connected to major transportation routes. Then they move in, not as an invading army, but as new neighbors who just happen to ride motorcycles. The first step is establishing a physical presence. They purchase or lease properties for clubhouses. These buildings aren't hidden or disguised. They're deliberately visible and intimidating. Most feature heavy steel gates, extensive security camera systems, and reinforced walls that could withstand a small war. Inside, organizational meetings are conducted. Internal discipline is enforced, and criminal operations are planned. Some clubhouses even display coded messages and symbols painted on exterior walls. These aren't just social gathering places. They're military command centers. From these bases, the club begins cultivating strategic relationships. They don't waste time trying to influence politicians or community leaders. Instead, they focus on people who own valuable property, operate cash-intensive businesses, or control useful services. Tattoo parlors, automotive repair shops, towing companies, and metal fabrication businesses often become unofficial support networks. Some are directly owned by club members. Others are simply friendly to the organization's presence and goals. Visibility becomes a crucial weapon. Club members make themselves seen riding in formation, attending charity events, or hosting community gatherings. To some observers, they appear to be a legitimate brotherhood, engaged in positive community activities. And sometimes, that facade contains elements of truth. But behind the public relations campaign, serious criminal activities continue operating. Illegal weapons sales, drug distribution networks, and protection rackets, all tightly organized and extremely difficult for outsiders to detect or trace. Real control emerges through the systematic application of fear. Businesses that refuse to cooperate might discover their windows mysteriously shattered. Residents who speak out against the club's presence might face ongoing harassment, property damage, or worse. Most people quickly learn not to report incidents to police, either because previous complaints have been ignored or because they understand that cooperation with law enforcement will inevitably be discovered and punished. The club also operates through support clubs, smaller, less visible biker organizations that function under Hells Angels' influence and protection. These satellite groups handle lower-level criminal activities, maintain surveillance on potential threats, and provide additional manpower when situations require overwhelming force. It's a brilliant system for extending territorial control while keeping top-level members insulated from direct legal exposure. Over months and years, this presence begins to feel permanent and unchangeable, not because it's legal or officially sanctioned, but because no effective opposition emerges to challenge it. Police patrols near known clubhouses become infrequent and cautious. Residents stop reporting crimes or suspicious activities. Local businesses adapt their operations to accommodate the new reality. And gradually, almost imperceptibly, the town begins operating according to rules that the Hells Angels have established, rather than laws that the government has enacted. The process doesn't happen overnight, and it rarely generates sensational news coverage. But in community after community, the warning signs are unmistakable. Eerily quiet streets after dark, local businesses operating under obvious stress, and clubhouses that never seem to close or reduce their level of activity. This is how a criminal organization conquers territory in modern America, not through dramatic confrontations or publicity-seeking violence, but through patience, strategy, and the gradual erosion of legitimate authority. They don't need to fire a single shot if the mere possibility of violence is enough to achieve their objectives. Yes, going underground. For decades, law enforcement remained trapped in a reactive cycle, only responding after violence had already occurred and evidence had been destroyed or hidden. But eventually, federal agencies realized that dismantling the Hells Angels would require them to penetrate the organization from within, no matter how dangerous that mission might prove to be. The most famous and perilous of these operations was ATF's Operation Black Biscuit. In the early 2000s, an agent named Jay Dobbins constructed an elaborate false identity as a gun runner and weapons dealer, then spent more than 2 years slowly earning the trust of the Arizona Hells Angels chapter. The psychological toll was enormous. Dobbins had to participate in staged crimes, fake assaults, and convince seasoned criminals that he had committed murder. Every conversation was potentially recorded. Every relationship was a calculated deception, and every day brought the possibility of discovery and execution. But gradually, painstakingly, he worked his way deeper into the organization's inner circle. The intelligence gathered during Operation Black Biscuit was unprecedented. For the first time, law enforcement obtained detailed recordings of criminal planning sessions, witnessed the club's internal hierarchy in action, and documented the sophisticated methods they used to conduct illegal operations while avoiding prosecution. The operation ultimately resulted in multiple arrests and provided federal prosecutors with evidence they had never possessed before. But the personal cost to Dobbins was staggering. Even after the operation concluded successfully, the threat of retaliation never ended. He later revealed that he lived under constant security protection for years, knowing that the Hells Angels had long memories and resources to track down enemies anywhere in the world. Similar undercover operations were conducted across the country, each one requiring agents to risk their lives for months or years at a time. Even with these dangerous infiltrations, securing convictions remained extraordinarily difficult. The Hells Angels employed strict internal security protocols, sophisticated coded communication systems, and ironclad loyalty oaths designed to protect high-ranking members from legal consequences. When one chapter was successfully prosecuted and dismantled, others would quickly move to fill the vacuum. The organization's decentralized structure made it nearly impossible to deliver a fatal blow to the entire network. But these operations proved something crucial. The Hells Angels weren't invincible or untouchable. With sufficient time, coordination, and evidence, law enforcement could inflict serious damage on their operations. For the first time in decades, the balance of fear was beginning to shift away from the club and toward the justice system that had been hunting them. The tide begins to turn. As federal law enforcement intensified its campaign against the Hells Angels, something unexpected began happening. Ordinary citizens started fighting back. The legacy of fear. The story of how the Hells Angels seized control of towns like Fontana, Barstow, and Bass Lake reveals something disturbing about the fragility of law and order in America. It demonstrates what happens when fear occupies the space where legitimate authority should exist, and how power can shift from elected officials to criminal organizations without a single vote being cast or a single law being changed. The battle isn't over. In courtrooms across the country, prosecutors continue building cases against club members. In small towns throughout America, residents continue organizing to resist criminal influence. And in federal agencies, agents continue risking their lives to gather the evidence needed to dismantle these organizations permanently. The question that haunts every community that lived through this experience is whether it could happen again. For every town that found the strength to stand up and fight back, there are others where silence still reigns supreme, where certain questions aren't asked, and where people have learned to look the other way when motorcycles rumble through their streets. The Hells Angels proved that in America, Control doesn't always flow from the ballot box or the courthouse. Sometimes it grows from fear, spreads through intimidation, and takes root in the quiet spaces where good people choose to remain silent rather than risk everything to resist. And in those spaces, the sound of approaching engines still carries the weight of unspoken threats and unanswered questions about who really controls the streets where we live.